the collective unconscious, if it's there. By the same token, Jung, because he was not a materialist, he could discover the collective unconscious, but he never could have acknowledged the Oedipal complex, if it's really there. So our lenses do stop us from being able to consider certain information, but there's nothing wrong with that. Ideally, we want to be open-minded and take in as much information as possible, but the reality of it, I hate that phrase, and I just used it, the reality of it. I hate when people say that. But the truth of the matter is that we have to pick and choose the information that we take in and how it is that we take it and what some of our presuppositions are. Empiricism, again, all knowledge is derived from sense experience. Idealism, all knowledge is derived from the mind. I talked a little bit about rationalism, which is a combination between the two. And of course, the implications and consequences of all of this is that if it's true, all of our knowledge is derived from the five senses, we have this problem. Because we know that the senses are oftentimes deceived, which means that the information that we're working off of is faulty, which means we're making faulty decisions. But also this big one right here that Socrates is very concerned about, that we seem to know things and concepts that we've never experienced before. So if it's true that all knowledge comes through the five senses, we shouldn't have any knowledge of something like infinity or perfection. You shouldn't have any idea of what love is until you're much older, until you've experienced it and can rationally understand it. So there's a whole bunch of things that we shouldn't know, but we do seem to know. Have any of you guys ever watched, I don't know, a TV show like Jeopardy? I don't even know if Jeopardy's still on television. Have you ever heard a question, and you answered the question, and you have no idea how you answered the question? You don't know how you knew something? Ever? Yeah, it happens sometimes. You're like, oh, whoa, I knew that. How did I know that? That's this thing right here that Socrates is talking about. And we seem to know things that we've never experienced before. I distinguish between true belief and knowledge. And now we are off to Socrates and Plato. All right. Did I get to here last time? Yeah. Okay, good. So we got Socrates, and I want you to have Socrates' dates. Those are the important ones. 470 to 399 BC. That is on your test. It's one of the, I think it's probably the only date I'm going to ask you to remember the entire school year. And then Socrates was Plato's teacher. Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. And then Alexander, of course, taught a lesson to the whole damn world with his empire. All right. Did not get to hear, though, did I?
You did.
I did. What? I showed this one to you? You guys have seen this before? Yeah. Plato, Aristotle, Diogenes, all these important people. All right. All right, Socrates. I know I did not get to hear.
No.
No?
You
Did not. Liars, all of you. All right, so he's an Athenian philosopher. Of course, I want you to know that he's from Athens. That's his cultural understanding. You should know that you should know that Mussolini was Italian. You should know that, Gandhi was Indian, and you should know that Socrates was an Athenian. Athens is a city in Greece, but at the time they weren't a country. Each city was its own state. They're referred to as city-states. It wasn't until later on that they were unified. And he's famous for the Socratic Method. Socratic Method is this method of asking questions. In other words, you don't just tell somebody some information, you ask them a bunch of questions to lead them to an answer. And some of you, I'm certain have had teachers in the past who have done things like Socratic seminars, and if you know what that is, that's how you're supposed to carry those out. It's a question and answer session to get you to ask a bunch of questions that leads you to knowledge. And it's important here because the knowledge that you're being led to is not somebody else's opinion. It isn't you're supposed to sit around and discuss each other's opinions and then know each other's opinions. That doesn't get you any closer to knowledge. The idea is that you're supposed to sit around and ask questions. And in asking each other questions, you come to an understanding of knowledge. And that's an important distinction because for Socrates, as we're going to see, he believes that you already know everything. He believes that you already know everything. Not like you're an 8-year-old and you think you know everything, but you actually do have access to all knowledge. When I say all knowledge, I'm talking about all knowledge in the universe. When we zoomed out earlier on that size comparison of the universe thing, everything that's in that universe, he argues, you've experienced before. You know what it is. You've been there. The way that a teacher teaches is by asking you questions to help you remember what you already know. And he doesn't just throw that out there. In his dialogues, he actually does give us some examples, and he shows us how it works. This is important as well. He fought in the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 4. You don't even know the dates for that one. But don't forget, remember this name, Alcibiades. He was a friend of a guy named Alcibiades. Did you guys play Assassin's Creed? What was it, Origin? Which one was it when they were in Athens, or they were in Greece? Odyssey, that's right, Odyssey. And you actually encounter this guy, Alcibiades. He's there. You encounter Socrates as well. And the way that they have Socrates in there is actually probably a lot like what he really was. And Alcibiades is the flamboyant, hey, how is everybody? That's Alcibiades. Socrates was close friends with him. And the reason that matters is because during the Peloponnesian War, he fought for Athens, Alcibiades. But then he messed up a few things. And so he said, well, time to leave Athens. And he traded sides and then started fighting for Sparta, the enemies. And then Alcibiades he went all Alcibiades, and he pissed them off too. So then he went and fought for the Persians, who were there as well. And then he got a good deal from Athens. They said, hey, come back, because he was a strong commander. And then he traded sides from Persia and went back to Athens. So this is a guy who, during the Peloponnesian War, was fighting for all the different sides. You can imagine what his reputation was like. Imagine if Canada, and the U.S. go to war, and then I go fight for Canada. I fight for the United States, and then we're losing, so I'm like, well, I'm going to jump this ship, and I go fight for Canada. And I'm like, hey, I've come to fight for you guys, eh? And then they're, sure, why not? And then I fight for them a little bit, but then we start to lose on that side, so then I go fight for, a third party who's involved as well. So I go fight for China or whatever. And then when that goes bad, I jump back to San Diego. Are you guys going to welcome me with open arms? Especially if we lose that war? No. So Alcibiades had a really horrible reputation, and him and Socrates were close friends. That's important. In fact, Alcibiades says that Socrates saved his life. So Alcibiades was going to be killed at one point during the Peloponnesian War, and Socrates ran in and saved him. Now that tells us something about Socrates. He's courageous. It tells us also he's a warrior. He's a warrior. And this is an important thing to keep in mind as well. Socrates believed that Athens was defeated because Athenian culture sucks. He was very vocal about that. He was saying, hey, you guys know why we lost that war? Why, Socrates? Because we suck. That's why. Because we're degenerate. Because we're weak. Because we're stupid. That's why we lost. And in fact, at one point when Sparta wins the war, they send this group of people to come over and rule over Athens. They're called the 70 Tyrants. Of course, that's from Athens' perspective. I'm sure if you ask Spartans, they'd say, oh, they're the 70 heroes. But they're referred to as the 70 tyrants by the Athenians. And so Socrates sees them all show up. And Socrates, by the way, thinks that Spartan culture is wonderful. He thinks it's pretty damn good. So he's like, man, the Spartans are here. Finally, we can see how real men rule a government. This, of course, makes him very, very unpopular among Athenians. And then Socrates goes and actually tutors the main guy, Ctesias. He goes to the guy and says, hey, I'm going to tutor you and teach you all about Athens. That way you can rule over us better, because you are the superior culture. So now you're starting to get a sense of how Socrates was really viewed. He wasn't a guy who went in with his hands all folded and, I'm going to seek truth. That wasn't him at all. He refers to himself as a gadfly. A gadfly is a fly that stings a horse and annoys it. That's all it does. It doesn't get anything out of it. Just ding, 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 and pisses off the horse. He says that he was the gadfly of Athens. So he was the original troll. If he had an account today, he'd be shit posting, no doubt. Very important. He was unemployed, had no job, and he was married to a woman named Xanthe. And Xanthe was 40 years younger than him, it seems. So he was 70 when he died. She was probably 30. I mention her whenever I bring up Socrates because she has a reputation for having been an absolutely horrible, terrible wife. Constantly nagging him, constantly annoying him. there's a story that she takes she's mad at him, so she takes a bedpan. You know what a bedpan is? It's where you poop and pee. So she takes a chamber pot, a bedpan, and dumps it over his head because she's mad at him. So there are characters in Shakespeare where whenever you see like a wife who's a nagger, they refer to her as Xanthip. So that's how she's eternally known. And she really was. She was a real horrible nag when you look at her. For example, well, I know this is going to piss you guys off, but she expected Socrates to get a job. Can you believe that? She wanted him to, this one's especially crazy, she wanted him to actually come home and stop hanging out with the boys. And she wanted him to help raise the children, because they had 2 children. Can you believe that? What a terrible wife, right? Just because, so when she dumps the chamber pot on his head, you can understand why. I think they had 3 children, not 2. I think they had 3. You can imagine what this is. Can you come help raise the children? I got to go find truth. Sorry. Can you come home and stop hanging out with the boys, and maybe get a job and help in some way? I can't do that right now. I got to go find out the nature of justice. So this explains why she would take a chamber pot and dump it on his head. But because of that, she's remembered as being a terrible wife. And that bugs me. It always has. So whenever I talk about Socrates, I always mention Xanthip because she has a terrible reputation. She doesn't deserve it. In fact, if anything, she kept Socrates alive. You're going to notice that she's 40 years his junior, and she was the daughter of, we think, was probably a nobleman, maybe even a senator, which means that she was very well connected politically. And that is probably what kept Socrates alive as long as he was alive. Because the Athenians hated his guts, and they were trying to get him executed on a number of occasions. But the fact that his wife was so powerfully connected, that's probably what kept him alive. And so even though she kept him alive, even though she raised the family, even though she had very reasonable expectations, she's remembered as being this horrible, nagging wife for all of eternity. It sucks. We're also going to notice that because she was 40 years his junior, that tells us that Socrates was not just a nobody. He was a somebody. Because that means that likely means that she was married off to him. That she came from a very politically connected family. It was probably some kind of a political arrangement. So Socrates was a somebody. We tend to think of him as illiterate because we're going to see, he never wrote down his own philosophy. But he wasn't illiterate. There's no way he could have been illiterate. But we think of that because he never wrote his philosophy down. Most of what we have was written by Plato. And mention here that everything that we have was written by Plato or Xenophon. Xenophon was one of his other students. I believe Xenophon wrote 5 dialogues, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's 5 altogether. Aristotle mentioned Socrates as well in his writing. And then we have a play written by the dramatist Aristophanes. I didn't mention it, but the play is called Clouds. And Aristophanes, who was a very well-known playwright at the time, he writes a play in which he makes fun of Socrates. And Socrates apparently used to go to the play to see himself get made fun of. And when his character would come out on stage, Socrates would stand up in the crowd and be like, "Yep, that's me." And he would laugh at himself. So Socrates, we learned some things about him. He really wanted to be famous. He liked the fact that people knew who he was. He liked the fact that he was so politically connected. But he didn't write anything down, probably because, well, we know what it was. He believed that philosophy shouldn't be written down, that your philosophy should live in your life. That you can tell what a person believes by how they live their lives. And if a philosopher is truly a great philosopher, they don't need to write a book and tell you about it. What will happen is people will congregate around that person and say, that's how I want to live too. And then they'll go on. And at some point, somebody may ask them, "God, where did you get this perspective of life?" "From my teacher, Socrates. He used to always say, blah, blah, blah." And that passed down the generations. If a philosopher deserves to be remembered, they'll be remembered this way, rather than being remembered by books. I've mentioned before Diogenes. He's the guy in the academy who's like laying down on the stairs. He's the one who told Alexander the Great to get out of the sunlight. Diogenes never wrote down a single word either. But here we are, 2,500 years later, we know who this guy was. So maybe there is something to that. Lastly, Aristophanes was a well-known playwright. So the fact that he's writing a play in his own lifetime about Socrates tells us that Socrates was very well-known also. That would be like if Quentin Tarantino came along and made a movie making fun of you. He wouldn't do that unless everyone knew who you were. It wouldn't make any sense. So, an idealist in the philosophical sense. He believed that all knowledge comes through the mind. And again, it's the teacher's job to help students remember what they already know. Now, Plato. All I want you to get from this, student of Socrates, of course, he established one of the first schools in the Western world called the Academy. I want you to know that too. He established one of the first schools in the Western world. He establishes the Academy. And that, again, is just something that, I'll have a question on the test about that. I just want you to know that because it's one of those things that people should know. When you're moving through life, when you're traveling through life, you'll interact with people. It's good for you to know stuff. It's called cultural literacy. You should know some things about it because they're important events. And they are important not just because someone said that they were, but because they shape who we are today. They've led us to this point. Plato wrote 35 dialogues. In fact, he kind of innovated the dialogue form. So in all of his books, Socrates is the character. And he has Socrates talking to people, trying to figure out what is justice, what's the nature of the soul. Plato doesn't just write down and say, here's what Socrates believed, or here's what I believe. He always had a character, Socrates in his plays, who would demonstrate it by talking to people. That's how he would demonstrate what he believed. Here's the thing I like a lot, man. It was said that he was an Olympic. Well, didn't have the Olympics. That's something else, but it's essentially the modern Olympic Games. He was an Olympiad, two-time laurel winner, which is the gold medal, in something called pancration. Pancration is MMA without all those silly rules. So you could bite, scratch, eye gouge, choke. Everything was legal. It's a little creepy when you realize that they did it naked, but the Greeks were the Greeks, right? So he was a two-time champion in pancration. Yeah, so he was a badass, Plato. We have this idea that a person is either an intellect or a fighter or a warrior. This idea of separating these two things is a very 20th century idea. That like skinny little nerdy writer who sits in a coffee shop with his glasses and writes these great adventures while holding his elbow like this, that's a very 20th century idea. In fact, even when you look at most of the 20th century writers, they went out and they just did adventure, man. They just did crazy stuff, man. And then they would go back and write about it because, of course, one of my former students sent me a message and asked me for some advice on how to be a writer. And you should know that if you ever send me a message about asking me for something like that, it's going to take me a few days to get back to you, but when I do, you're going to get an essay. So I sent him 17 pieces of advice for how to be a writer yesterday. And one of them was, you can't write about stuff that you don't know about. We know this. So I told him that his job as a writer is to go out and experience things. Don't tell me, don't tell me what an experience would be like. Go out and do it, and then come back and tell me what it is like. And that means if you're going to write about love, well, you better have been in love before. And if you're going to write about heartbreak, you better have had your heart broken before. If you're going to write about adventure, you better have had adventures before. And maybe you haven't had the exact adventure that you're writing about, like traveling in space, but you should have had some adventures before, so that you can write about the exhilaration and all that of actual adventure. There's a band, my favorite band is called The Smiths. The Smiths has a singer, Morrissey. And I think, I genuinely believe it would be impossible for almost any human being to listen to a Smiths record and not say, I have felt that way. Because he's writing about things and experiences that I can't believe any of us haven't had before. And then Morrissey wrote a love novel. Morrissey famously has never been seen in public with any dates. They don't know if he's gay, straight, bi. They have no idea what the heck he is. He doesn't talk about it in interviews. His love life is extremely private. He's never been seen with anybody. So how does a guy like that write a love novel? And his love novel was trash. It was horrible. He had a 2-book deal. He wrote a second one. probably just as bad as the first. Of course he can't write about it. He's trying to write about love as someone who read about love. You can't read about an experience and then go out and talk about how you've lived it. You actually have to do it. And you'll notice that there's a difference between people like that. If someone has done some stuff in their lives, they talk about it differently. They carry themselves differently. So, philosophers should be that. Writers should be that. Artists should be that. The idea that you can just be the little bookish type, those are boring, man. There are some who are talented, of course. They can pull it off, but by and large, no. His nickname was Plato. His real name was Aristocles. Plato is just a nickname. And the word Plato means broad, like wide. It seems to refer to the size of his forehead. He had a big, giant forehead, apparently. And so, forever known as Giant Forehead Man. But what about my philosophy? What about how I shaped all of Western culture? You have a big forehead, dude. It's also suggested it could refer to the size of his shoulders, because he was a wrestler and a pancration fighter. Can you see this picture here? I'll have a close one. That's a CGI of what we think Plato looks like, based off of the statues that we have of him. And then again, because Socrates never wrote down any of his philosophy, sometimes you'll hear me refer to Socrates and Plato interchangeably. I'll say, here Plato believes this, or here Socrates believes this. I'll try to delineate. But we don't know what Plato believed apart from Socrates, because he always uses Socrates as a character in his writings. And we should point out that Diogenes hated Plato. Diogenes hated Plato. Plato was trying to figure out the definition of a human. He said, what is it to be human? And he comes to the following definition. Plato says, a human is a featherless biped, something that walks on two legs and has no feathers. And Plato's students, because they were tourists, all sat around and said, good, master, now we know. And Diogenes went to the marketplace and stole a chicken, tore its feathers out, and showed up at Plato's academy and said, behold, Plato's man! Because it was a featherless biped. It walked on two legs and had no feathers. And when Plato would go and give lectures, Diogenes would follow him around with the featherless chicken and say, look, I have your man here, Plato. Did you want your man back? He trolled Plato. He used to go and listen to Plato's lectures and eat apples during his lecture just to make the crunching sound, just to annoy him. So Diogenes did not like Plato. He thought that Plato did not truly represent who Socrates was. So I'll leave it at that. Socrates, Plato, and this is what our CGI things seem to suggest they look like. When you look at that, you can kind of get the idea. It was said that Socrates was a fat, little dumpy man. And you can kind of see it there. A big old pot belly, kind of walked around, but was still a warrior, did fight in the Peloponnesian War, did save Alcibiades' life. Apparently he had a really jacked up nose. He had a really funny looking nose. And you can kind of see it, here in his nose. It is an odd nose. And the whole idea of Plato being a pancration fighter, for some reason, you can kind of intellectually understand that. But man, when I saw this, I said, okay, now I can see it. He looks like, someone who's serious. You can only get so much from those busts, from the statue. But when I saw this, I was like, okay, yeah, he looks like a guy who would want to fight a bear or something. So, questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques?